Okay, so it's now 3 o'clock, and I want to welcome everyone on this beautiful fall day. And if you've chosen to be with us, I thank you for choosing us over the wonderful weather. But my name is David Tate, and I'm on the Encore Learning Special Events Committee, which works hard to bring you these events. And today we have a very interesting topic. We have author Larry Spinelli to discuss his biography of Peter W. Rodino Jr., who oversaw the Nixon impeachment hearings and was involved in many more historical events that are documented in the book. But before we get rolling, I do want, as always, to give people a heads up on the technology here that we're using. And we take questions. We're going to hold them to the end. But if you want to submit a question, use the Q&A function. Just find that icon on your device, type in your question, hit enter or send, and we'll have the question. We're going to hold to the end. You can put the questions in at any time during the presentation as soon as it pops into your head. And also, we have live transcript available. That's under your control. Again, you find the icon, click on it to either invoke it, have it on your screen, or to take it off your screen. When you leave the webinar, you will see a survey request. It's brief. We appreciate if you would fill that out. And finally, if you have any technical Zoom problems, you can send an email to info@encorelearning.net, and there'll be someone there to respond to your email to try to help you out with whatever technical problem you have. Okay, and then just want to let people know of upcoming events. We have one on the calendar for November 18th. Again, it's always a Monday, beginning at 3 o'clock. And this is a Katrina story by Suzette Walker. And this is going to be a firsthand account of her survival story from Katrina and how she made her way to a welcoming community of Arlington to build a new life. So it kind of has a local wrinkle to it. So with that, I'm going to stop my share. And before I introduce our speaker today, if folks can just indulge me to express my thanks and appreciation and best wishes, I guess, to Chris McLaughlin, who has been the chair of the Encore Learning Special Events Committee for over 12 years and will be passing the torch. It's really via her leadership, her inspiration, her dedication, and her tireless work ethics that the committee has been able to bring a variety of tours to Encore Learning members, as well as these lectures to the wide range of lectures to the public at large. And I think she's left a amazing legacy. And actually, we are fortunate that we switched over to the virtual format with the advent of COVID. And by virtue of that, we've been able to document a portion of that legacy with the recordings, which are posted on Encore Learning's YouTube channel. So I just want to, I think I speak for many people within Encore Learning and outside Encore Learning to express my gratitude and thanks for all the work that Chris has done, all the accomplishments, all the contributions that she's made to Encore Learning. So I just wanted to take time to do that. And as a side note, yours truly will also be stepping aside. I guess there's a desire for new energy, and I do believe that there's a beginning and ending to all things. It's been wonderful to do these events, and I do want to extend appreciation to the audience. It's the audience has helped to elevate many of these events with their insightful questions and also the feedback. So thank you all to past audience and all those who tuned in. So, okay, with that out of the way, we want to get on. The show goes on, and I want to introduce our speaker today. And also, I'm going to open the chat after I introduce Larry. If anyone wants to say anything about Chris's tenure, please do that in the chat. The questions go in the Q&A. So we have with us today Larry Spinelli. He received a doctorate degree in history from New York University. His undergraduate studies were at Drew University, where he later taught political science as an assistant professor. He's held a variety of senior level positions in the legislative and executive branches of the federal government, including a long tenure with the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Most pertinent to the topic at hand this afternoon is his very first job on Capitol Hill as press secretary to Representative Peter Rodino Jr. He later spent 5 years as director of communications for then Senator Joe Biden. This experience and his academic background made him uniquely qualified to pen the first and only biography of Peter Rodino Jr., best known for his role in the Nixon impeachment proceedings. The book provides insight into how the arc of Rodino's life provided him with the skills and character to undertake this important role. Larry also has won acclaim for his prior book, Dry Diplomacy, The United States, Great Britain, and the Prohibition. We appreciate Larry coming here today to give us a taste of the story of Peter Rodino, but I would highly encourage people to read the book. It provides a lot of insight into the history of not just Watergate, but also other important events in which Representative Rodino played a key role. So with that, please, everyone, give a warm virtual welcome to Larry Spinelli. Take it away, Larry.
Okay. Thank you, David, very much. And let me thank Encore Learning for the invitation and all of you for being here today. I really appreciate it, and for taking the time out of your schedules. And as David mentioned, particularly on a very nice day to be here and to share some of my reflections on Peter Rodino and coming out of the book that I wrote, Watergate's Unexpected Hero. If I can take you back 51 years, actually right this moment, 51 years yesterday, and for the next few days that are following, including today, these were key moments in Peter Rodino's life. So we didn't exactly plan it this way, but it is really the perfect time for me to be doing this talk. So 51 years ago, on a fairly nice October Saturday in October, the weather was kind of like this, and Peter Rodino was where he always was on a Saturday. He was home in Newark, New Jersey, doing all of the constituent outreach activities that he had been doing every weekend since he became a member of Congress in 1949. And after making the rounds at a variety of events and holding office hours in his local district office, he headed back home to his house and to relax and put his feet up and turned on the television. And to his total surprise, across the bottom of the screen was a ticker running, announcing special bulletin, special bulletin. Now, for those of you that can remember back to 1973, there were 3 television stations. There was no cable. There was no streaming. There was no TikTok. So this is how you got your news. And when something happened and you were watching a television show, the special bulletin would break in and tell you. Well, this special bulletin announced that the Attorney General of the United States and his deputy had just resigned because they refused to fire the special prosecutor who had been appointed to look into all of the details of the Watergate scandal. President Richard Nixon had ordered them to fire that special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. They both refused and resigned. And the FBI then entered the office of the special prosecutor, asked the staff to leave, and started seizing the records. This was a catastrophic event. It sent shockwaves through the country. And I know maybe we've gotten a little numb to political shockwaves, but this was really devastating. And it was the culmination of a series of events that have been taking place for more than a year since the break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate building over on Virginia Avenue. And what was dismissed initially as a second-rate burglary, thanks to the doggedness of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, young reporters at the Washington Post, eventually turned into a major scandal of dirty tricks run by the Committee to Re-elect President Nixon, ultimately connected to the White House, to White House staff, leading to a grand jury, a trial, convictions, and the Senate holding a series of hearings throughout the spring and the summer of 1973, which ultimately unveiled the fact that there were secret recordings of White House conversations, which really blew the lid off of the entire scandal. There had been a lot of rumors and a lot of suggestions that maybe the House of Representatives should consider beginning the process of impeaching a president, but nothing had really happened. Rodino was very cautious, the Speaker of the House was cautious, but this was really the final straw, and the country really felt that it was in the midst of a constitutional crisis. So the next day, Peter Rodino did something he had never done before. He cut his weekend short. He flew back to Washington, D.C. to have a series of meetings up on Capitol Hill. And the purpose of the meetings was to discuss whether or not the House of Representatives should begin an impeachment inquiry and who should be in charge of it. Peter Rodino believed that the House Judiciary Committee, which he was the chairman of, should rightfully be in charge of. They had always handled impeachments. There had been 12 judicial impeachments. The committee had handled them. The last presidential impeachment, which had happened in 1868, was handled by the House Judiciary Committee. But other people thought, well, we should maybe put together a special committee. The House Judiciary Committee was already very busy. They were beginning the process of confirming a new vice president. For the first time in the history of the United States, the 25th Amendment, which provided for replacing a vacancy in the vice presidency, was being implemented because of the resignation of Spiro Agnew. I'm sure some of you out there remember Spiro Agnew. Well, he got caught up with tax fraud and kickbacks when he was a governor of Maryland and had been forced to resign. President Nixon nominated Gerald Ford, and under the 25th Amendment, both the House and the Senate had to hold hearings on the nomination and then vote. And the House Judiciary Committee was about to begin this process. So some people said the committee was already too busy, but Rodino made an effective case to Speaker Albert and said, no, we're the ones that should be doing this. And 2 days later, the Speaker announced that, in fact, the House Judiciary Committee would be given the responsibility to begin to conduct the first presidential impeachment inquiry in more than 100 years. And, there was some concern of people looked at this and said, well, I'm not sure that this is the right person to do this. This is the right individual to manage such an important thing. And, one of the newspapers at the time said, this is like sending in your rookie into a World Series game when all the bases are already loaded. Because Rodino was not very well known. He had only become the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the beginning of the year. So he'd only been in the job for 10 months after serving for decades in the shadows, in the legislative shadows. He was not very well known. He was from Newark, New Jersey, a city that had suffered through a lot of political scandals recently. And also, he was an Italian American, and people questioned at the time, there was a lot of ethnic stereotyping, even as reputable a newspaper as the New York Times suggested that Peter Rodino might in fact have ties to organized crime, which of course turned out to be absolutely false. So all of these things were out there questioning, doubting whether Rodino was up to the task. But what none of these naysayers bothered to do in October of 1973 was to take the time to look into Rodino's life, to look at his background, to read his biography, because what they would have found if they had bothered to do that is a man who had overcome many challenges in order to rise to the level that he had, who had persevered, who had shown amazing patience and doggedness. And in fact, he had all of the credentials that would make him Watergate's unexpected hero. So let me take you quickly back to the beginning. Peter Rodino was born in 1909 in Newark, New Jersey, in Little Italy, in a very tough neighborhood. His father, Pellegrino, was an immigrant from Italy. He was part of the Great Migration from Italy in the latter part of the 19th century. And he came to Newark because at the time, Newark was one of the great manufacturing centers of the United States. And they needed workers. And he came to take advantage of that and settled in Newark. And Peter Rodino was born actually Pellegrino and changed his name when he got to grammar school. The schools anglicized all the Italian names in those days. But they lived in a tenement building. It was a tough neighborhood. And when Rodino was 10 years old, he witnessed his first fatal shooting out at the street corner from his house. So it was not an easy upbringing. The fastest way to get ahead in Newark's Little Italy was either through gambling or bootlegging. And Rodino didn't either. He was blessed with a father who believed in abiding the law, who believed in upholding the Constitution, and all of this was instilled in Peter Rodino. And Rodino had the good fortune to go to the best high school in Newark, Barringer High School. He was 2 years behind a classmate named William Brennan. You may recognize Bill Brennan, future Supreme Court Justice. Amazing that this one high school produced these two incredible individuals. And Rodino decided that what he wanted to do with his life was to find a way to serve others. And he decided the way he was going to do that was to become a lawyer. And so he started out. In those days, you did not need a 4-year college degree to go to law school. You needed just 2 years. So he went to 2 years of college at night. He had all different jobs. And then when he was getting ready to go to law school, the Depression hit. His family had no money. His father lost his job, and Rodino couldn't even find a job. So he had to put this on hold for a while and took up a whole variety of different kind of jobs. He worked as a night clerk in a railroad station. He dispatched streetcars for the Public Service Company. He worked in a factory that made Ronson cigarette lighters. And he did all of this for 4 years, never losing sight of what his goal was, which was to become a lawyer. And eventually he had enough money, he was able to go to school at night. And this was what an average day was like for Peter Rodino. He would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, have breakfast, catch the streetcar, go down to the Ronson cigarette lighter factory for the 7 o'clock shift. He would work till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He would then walk over to law school and start his night classes, do a double duty of night classes. take the streetcar back to his apartment, get there about 10 o'clock, study till about 3 o'clock in the morning, and then he would get 2 hours of sleep till the alarm clock went off and he had to begin this all again. And this is the routine that he had for 3 years. And he later said that when he graduated law school and passed the bar, the first thing that he did was to throw out that alarm clock. So he put out his shingle as a lawyer, and he wanted to help his community. So while he was trying to make a living as a lawyer, he was also reaching out. He was giving English language lessons to the Italians in the community. He was helping people to become citizens, Italian Americans, and eventually, and he was a very good speaker and got a reputation for being a great speaker. And eventually, the Democratic Party took notice and they recruited him. He was a New Dealer, an Eleanor Roosevelt New Dealer, really a progressive from 1932 till the day he died. And they recruited him to join the party and to help them to spread the word about the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, which is what he did. And that's really what built his reputation in the Italian American community. Because of that involvement, he was appointed as an advisor to the local draft board when the United States implemented a peacetime draft right before, about 6 or 8 months before Pearl Harbor. And he, in that capacity, he could have, if he wanted to, gotten a deferment from the draft, but he decided not to. In fact, instead, he went and he enlisted and before Pearl Harbor, and he joined the Army as a private. Eventually, he went overseas and got into officers' candidate school because of his French language that he learned at Barringer High School. When the American Army went to the North Africa campaign in 1942, he was a very valuable member of the staff, did a lot of liaison work with the local community. Then the Army went and invaded Italy. Well, of course, he grew up speaking Italian. He became a very important part of that, part of the occupation forces in Rome. And when the war ended, he came back home. He had gone from being a private to being a highly decorated captain and a war hero. And so he decided that he wanted to get involved in a way to help veterans. And so in 1946, he decides he's going to run for Congress. Now, only someone like Peter Rodino would have taken this on, because at that point, his congressional district where he lived was a Republican district. And it was represented, had been represented for many years by Fred Hartley of Taft-Hartley fame. And the Democratic Party said, you're never going to win. We're not going to help you. We're not going to give you any money. But Rodino ran a grassroots campaign and came within 5,000 votes of beating Hartley. 2 years later, he ran again. Hartley retired. And to everybody's surprise, in what was considered a Republican district, Peter Rodino was elected to Congress and came to Congress in January of 1949. Now, in those days, Congress was run by the seniority system. So the rule was, if you're a freshman, you are seen but not heard. You listen to what the senior people are saying and you don't question it. Well, Peter Rodino followed that rule for about 6 weeks. And he was on the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and it was chaired by John Rankin from Mississippi, a absolutely unrepentant racist, segregationist, and an open anti-Semite, one of the most really reviled people in the Congress. And he ran the committee like a dictator. And so there was a bill before the committee on veterans benefits that Rodino didn't agree with. There was no agenda. There was no vote. and the bill was reported out, Rodino and several other members went to the floor to protest. Rodino was shaking in his boots, he said later, but he stood up, sought recognition from the speaker to complain about how the chairman had handled this, telling the people on the floor of the House that he had not gone to Europe and fought fascism to come back and have to face it in the United States Congress. When he finished his speech, the House of Representatives broke out into applause. It's against the rules to applause, but all his colleagues were so happy that somebody had finally taken on John Rankin. John Rankin, of course, wasn't happy, and he punished and isolated and froze out Rodino. But fortunately for Peter Rodino, that very day, sitting in the chamber with John Rankin's number one enemy, Emanuel Seller, liberal Democrat from New York, from Brooklyn, and the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And the first time a vacancy became available on the Judiciary Committee, even though it was supposed to go to somebody from Illinois, Seller offered it to Rodino, and it changed Rodino's life. Number one, he became Seller's trusted lieutenant, working side by side in the legislative trenches with him for the next 2 decades. But more importantly, it gave Rodino a platform to get involved in the 2 issues that were the most important to him and really would become the hallmark of his congressional career. The first was immigration. In 1924, Congress had passed the most prejudiced immigration bill in the history of the United States. And what it did is it set up a system based on national origin, not when you came, not what your qualifications were, but where you came from. And it was set up to make sure that the quotas for Italians and for Jews from Southeast Europe and Russia were very low, and that the quotas for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from England and Scandinavia were very high, even though people from those countries were not coming to the United States anymore. And as a result of that, Italian immigration dropped by over 90%. Families that had hoped to be reunited were not reunited. But most important, it was regarded in the Italian American community as a stigma, as a stain, as something that said that Italians were not welcome in the United States, that they were less than other Americans. And so when Rodino came to Congress, he was determined to try to end this discriminatory immigration law. It took a long time. Working with Emanuel Seller and many others, they worked for years. And finally, when the grandson of an immigrant, John F. Kennedy, became president of the United States, they had some hope. And after President Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson took on the fight. And in 1965, standing in the shadows of the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island, Lyndon Johnson signed the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, which abolished quotas based on where you came from. And Rodino had become one of the leading experts in the Congress on immigration. The second issue that was important to him was civil rights. Now, if you looked at his district and where he came from, he was representing primarily a white Italian-American district. Why were civil rights so important to him? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, he was from the Eleanor Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party. Civil rights were absolutely at the top of the list of priorities. But Rodino had also personally suffered as an Italian-American from discrimination. He was walking on the street when he was 17 years old. He was beat up by the police. He lost a tooth. He was bloodied. And he tried to get justice for what had happened to him. He never forgot that experience and what Italians had gone through. So when he arrived in Congress, even though it wasn't a political priority in his district, he made civil rights a top priority. And he was part of every effort to pass civil rights all through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that iconic photograph of Lyndon Johnson signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the East Room of the White House. Standing behind Lyndon Johnson is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and standing next to Dr. King is Peter Rodino. This was very much a part of what he considered a priority. He was involved in that, in the Voting Rights Act. He was the floor manager for the fair housing fight in 1966 and 1968. All of this, ironically, became very politically important to Rodino, because in 1972, after the new census came out and following Supreme Court rulings, there had to be a redistricting of all the districts in New Jersey. And when the legislature couldn't make a decision, the court selected a map for the districts, and Peter Rodino ended up with a district that was now a majority Black district. Majority of the voters in his district were African Americans. It was a safe Democratic district, but it was the primary. It was getting that nomination. And Rodino was facing an African American candidate. And the expectation was that Rodino was going to lose this primary in 1972. But what people forgot was that he had this amazing record on civil rights. And so Rodino had gone over to New York and met with A. Philip Randolph, the civil rights icon, the man who had established the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, the first Black union, and had been part of every civil rights effort. And A. Philip Randolph endorsed Peter Rodino, as did Bayard Rustin, and most of the major civil rights leaders of the day. They endorsed Rodino. And that made, I think, a lot of difference and gave him a credibility. But nonetheless, in June of 1972, the night of the primary, and I was there, so I can tell you firsthand, I was in college, I left school early to help Rodino. I used to drive him to factory gates in the morning. And I was there that night at the Robert Treat Hotel, and all the New York television stations and newspapers who never cared about what happened in New Jersey, they were there because they thought they were going to have a great story, which is the end of the political career of this longtime veterans. And instead, Peter Rodino won. And he won decisively in a way that said that he would be okay in this district. And in fact, he won the district for the rest of the time until he retired. But the television cameras and the reporters were not paying any attention to what was going on a couple weeks later in Brooklyn, where Emanuel Seller was defeated in his primary by Elizabeth Holtzman by 800 votes. So within a month, Peter Rodino had not only salvaged his career, but he knew when the new Congress convened, he was going to become, after waiting in the wings for many years, the new chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. And of course, within 10 months, he was going to become the person in charge of the first presidential impeachment since 1868. Now, when Rodino took this responsibility on in October 1973, he really didn't have a model to go by. The impeachment in 1868 of Andrew Johnson was very partisan. It was very discredited. It was not a model to follow. But Rodino did have an experience that was helpful. In the 1950s, he had served on a special committee that was looking into corruption in the Truman administration. It was very sensitive. Rodino was a Democrat, and it was politically sensitive, and it was a committee made up of Democrats and Republicans, chaired by a Democrat. And what he learned from that experience, that the key to success was bipartisanship. The Democrats and the Republicans worked together. They hired a professional staff, and the result was a report that was applauded by everybody. And so he knew that, and that's what he decided he was going to do. He wanted to get a bipartisan result. He wanted to have Democrats and Republicans getting together and believing that this was a fair and a thoughtful process. And if I could just read his own words, because I can't do them justice, of what he said. At the time, he said, "I want to proceed with such care and decency and thoroughness and honor that the vast majority of the American people and their children after them will say this was the right cause. There was no other way." And I think he would be very pleased to know that 50 years later, people still regard what he did as the gold standard for presidential impeachments. So the first thing Rodino did was he hired an outside counsel. He didn't use the regular committee staff, and he hired a Republican, John Doerr, who had worked in the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations, to come to Washington and put together a staff. It ended up being a staff of over 100 people that included all people of all backgrounds, as diverse as William Weld, a future Republican governor of Massachusetts, and Hillary Rodham, future Democratic presidential candidate and Democratic senator. And Rodino's only rule to John Doerr was, "I do not want any partisans on the staff. They have to all be neutral." And then they began the process, and it was a deliberative one. Behind closed doors, the committee began gathering evidence from the grand jury, evidence from the Senate committee. They demanded some of the tapes from the White House, other documents, putting all of this together and looking at it in a way like a grand jury, behind closed doors, very thoughtful, very deliberative. Now, Rodino was pushed constantly to hurry up, hurry up. The Republicans complained. The White House complained. Tip O'Neill, his very dear friend, every time Rodino would go over to the floor, Tip would say, "Pete, come on, hurry up, hurry up." But again, if they had known Rodino's background, they would know he was dogged, he was patient, and nothing was going to make him rush. He was going to take all the time that was needed. Finally, in May of 1974, the committee began, again, behind closed doors, going through the evidence. The room was set up with earphones for them to listen, for the members to listen to the tapes. Up till that time, only Rodino and the ranking Republican had heard the tapes. And they listened to all of the tapes and all the other written evidence. Now, they wanted more information from Nixon. Nixon kept stonewalling and stonewalling. And finally, Nixon went on television in a great show and had a whole bunch of boxes of transcripts that he was going to offer the committee transcripts of the tapes they wanted. He refused to give them the tapes, the other tapes, but he would give them transcripts. And he sent them up to Capitol Hill, and where Rodino got the boxes, they opened them up, half the boxes were empty, and the ones that weren't empty had incomplete transcripts, and most of the transcripts were at odds with the transcripts that the committee itself had made of tapes that they had in their possession. But Nixon made a big mistake because he thought this was going to get him off the hook. And so he ordered the government printing office to publish all the transcripts. And the next day after that, it became a #1 bestseller. Everybody bought this book. And there wasn't much in there, but what there was in there was a lot of redactions and a lot of expletives deleted. And people, the public, was shocked that the President of the United States was using bad language in the White House, the rawness of the language of the conversations. People were shocked. And of course, the really important stuff, the smoking gun, none of that was there. The public had not seen that, but just seeing this shocked the public and turned them against Nixon and helped the committee. And when the committee heard the tapes, they were also shocked. And they continued behind closed doors, deliberating, and finally, they were getting ready for open hearings, and Rodino did a very smart thing. He took all of this material that had been behind closed doors, that was not a question of national security, and made it all public in the weeks before the committee met. And it was all reprinted in the newspapers, and many of you out there may remember reading it in the New York Times, or maybe you even went and bought the book that the GPO printed. And so the public had seen a lot of this. And then the committee met. It was very sober. It was a very sobering occasion that night. It was televised. And they began with opening statements from members of the committee. People didn't know who these people were. And for the most part, they all rose to the occasion. They were all elevated in their conversations. And I'm sure many of you remember the eloquence of people like Barbara Jordan. The nation had never seen Barbara Jordan before. She wasn't known outside of Texas. She became really a national figure because of this. But they all spoke of the anguish of having to make the decision, the importance of it, the seriousness of it. Nobody gloated. Nobody took cheap shots. It really was a very serious, sobering deliberation. And once the opening statements were done, all live on national television, the committee began to deliberate on articles of impeachment. Ultimately, they approved 3 articles of impeachment. The first one was obstruction of justice, and 6 Republicans voted with the Democrats. So there was a bipartisan vote on these articles of impeachment, which is what Rodino was hoping for. And when the committee finished its work, they were getting ready to bring the articles to the floor of the House of Representatives. And a group of Republican leaders went down to the White House to tell Nixon he was in big trouble, particularly after the Supreme Court had ordered him to release all the tapes that the special prosecutor wanted. And that included the famous smoking gun tape that showed only 3 days after the Watergate break-in, Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, was engaged personally in trying to cover up and obstruct justice. And when the Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee heard that tape, all the ones that had defended Nixon and that had voted against that article of impeachment, they came out and told reporters and said, if we had heard that, we would have voted for impeachment, that they put their country above partisanship. So Nixon resigned. They never went to the floor, and that was the end of it. Now, 80 million people watched the impeachment inquiry. So Peter Rodino, this unknown congressman from New Jersey, became a national figure. People recognized, knew who he was. He was offered money to write a book. He was offered money to go on the paid lecture circuit, but he refused. He said, "This was my job. This was my responsibility. I am not going to cash in on it." But the one thing that he was willing to do was to go out and help elect Democrats to the Congress to pass the kind of legislation that he believed in. So he started traveling all over the country, giving speeches, doing fundraisers for Democrats. And one of the people that I interviewed, James Blanchard, who was then a congressman who went on to become governor of Michigan and ambassador to Canada, said that he was so thrilled when Rodino agreed to come out to Michigan to do a fundraiser for him. And in all his years in politics, it was the most successful fundraiser he ever held, because Peter Rodino was literally that famous everywhere he went. The Washington Post said that having Peter Rodino at your fundraiser or endorse your candidacy was like having the good housekeeping seal of approval for politics. So he became very well known. So much so that people even speculated, would Peter Rodino run for president, which he was not interested in doing and said no. But he did become a member of the short list of people who were being touted as potential vice presidential candidates once Jimmy Carter had secured the Democratic nomination for president in 1976. Tip O'Neill and a whole group of members of Congress got around and decided, we want Rodino. They held a press conference. They gave out these buttons. You see, I've got one, and which Mr. Rodino gave me, and really promoted his candidacy. And he made the short list. But Rodino, I was smart enough to realize, number one, he really didn't want to be the vice president. He'd rather be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And it was very unlikely that he would get selected. So when it was his time to be interviewed by Jimmy Carter in New York, a few days before the convention, he walked into the hotel room and told Carter, "Thank you for the honor, but I want to withdraw my name. I don't want you to proceed any further." And so what Carter said was, "What I would like to do instead then is, would you please give the nominating speech?" So Peter Rodino nominated Jimmy Carter for president. He gave the impeachment halo and embraced Jimmy Carter with that and hit the campaign trail and did a lot of campaigning for Jimmy Carter, especially within the Italian-American community. It's very important. He worked very closely with Jimmy Carter. As many of you know, Carter did not have the smoothest relationship with the Democrats in Congress, but Rodino was an ally of his, an advocate of his, and really helped him in every way he could possibly. And of course, we all know what happened in 1980. So Peter Rodino had 4 wonderful years as chairman of the Judiciary Committee with a Democratic president. And then it abruptly ended. And it didn't just end, it ended with a new conservatism coming to Washington, D.C., something that Peter Rodino had never seen. It was certainly not similar to Eisenhower or even Nixon. And so Rodino had to wear another hat. He now became the great obstructionist. As he himself said at the time, he was now like the boy with his finger in the dike. He was holding back all the efforts to try to amend the Constitution to outlaw school busing, amend the Constitution to allow prayers in public schools, amend the Constitution to require a balanced budget, all things that Rodino disagreed with in terms of policy, but also thought absolutely did not belong in the Constitution. And he did a very good job. He managed to keep all of these things out of the Constitution. He also, for many years, kept the Republicans from weakening gun control law, but eventually he could not stop that, and they were able to weaken the gun control law that had passed in 1968 following the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. The one bright spot during the Reagan years for Rodino was that he was able to work with Reagan and pass immigration reform. After the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, one of the changes that law made was it restricted for the first time immigration into the United States from the Western Hemisphere. And as a result, there was no longer a free flow of workers. And so there were a lot of undocumented workers in the United States, and they were being exploited. It was almost like there was this underground economy. Rodino was very concerned about this. He did not think this was right, and he wanted to do something to provide an amnesty for these people to give them a path to citizenship. But of course, conservatives didn't agree with that. And so Rodino had touted the idea of linking amnesty with stricter border control and also employer sanctions, to put a burden on employers so that they would only hire people with the proper documentation. This proved to be a winning formula to bridge the gap between progressives and conservatives. And in 1986, Rodino, working with the Reagan administration, passed immigration reform bill that did just that, provided amnesty to undocumented workers in the country, and imposed employer sanctions for people who hired undocumented workers who entered the country after a certain date, and strengthened border control. And it was the last time, 1986, the last time that Congress ever passed comprehensive immigration reform. And Rodino got some satisfaction of knowing that all of those granted amnesty under this legislation were known in Mexico as Los Rodinos. In 1988, with the Reagan administration over, no need to keep his finger in the dike, Peter Rodino decided he had been in Congress for 40 years, and this is a good time to retire. So he announced his retirement. He issued a statement in March 1988 outlining the things that were important to him and telling everybody that he believed he had served his time and a purpose, and he wanted to go into the next chapter of his life. What followed was a series of awards and accolades, and I was working for Rodino then as his press secretary. I got to write those speeches, and most important, I got to go with him to all these wonderful events, saluting him, every organization that you can imagine. But there was probably nothing that could top the United States Supreme Court honoring Peter Rodino at a reception and giving his remarks that day. Justice William Brennan turned to Rodino and said, "Well, Pete, I think we did pretty good for two boys from Barringer High School." So Peter Rodino left to those accolades, editorials, news stories, documentary on New Jersey Public Television, to the next chapter of his life, which was to become a professor of law at Seton Hall University Law School, They named their law library after Rodino. They housed his papers, and they have a collection of his memorabilia still, all of these things still true. And Rodino became a professor working with a law professor. He kept a copy of the Constitution in his back pocket and would walk in and could, at the drop of a hat, recite the preamble to the Constitution from heart. And he would tell stories about how the Constitution was a living document and how it meant something that impacted people every single day. And he really loved it. The school treated him as a celebrity. He was a big celebrity still in New Jersey. And he wasn't really forgotten, because in 1998, when Congress began looking into another presidential impeachment, both Republicans and Democrats hurried up to New Jersey to talk to Peter Rodino to get his advice on what they should do about the possible impeachment of then President Bill Clinton. And Rodino gave his advice freely to both sides, and he kept quiet for a while, but eventually he went public to voice his strong criticism of what the Judiciary Committee, controlled by the Republicans and his former colleague Henry Hyde, were doing. He thought that they had not met the bar for high crimes and misdemeanors. He thought that impeachment was highly partisan. He was very disappointed, and he was very upset that they were trying to use his name as the gold standard for what they were doing, which he felt was not the case. And that put him back in the public spotlight. He continued to teach, and in 2005, he, just a few months shy of his 96th birthday, Peter Rodino had pneumonia and he died at home. His funeral was held at Seton Hall University Law School, and they had a viewing there. A lot of officials from Washington came, and then his funeral mass was held at St. Lucy's Church, the church that he attended as a boy and where he had met his first wife. The only remnant, really, the only physical remnant of the old Little Italy still there. And that's where his funeral mass was. I think he would have appreciated that he had come full circle. But there were so many accolades at the time. But I want to close with one special one that I'd like to read to you, because I think it really says it all of what many other people were expressing. And this is from Senator Ted Kennedy. Many of us felt we were seeing a founding father in action, living the highest ideals of the Constitution. He wrote, Ted Kennedy wrote, of Rodino's leadership during the Nixon impeachment. I am sure my brother would have called him a profile in courage. I feel the same way, and I'll never forget him. I think what Kennedy was saying, and he was not alone in expressing this, in concluding that Peter Rodino had certainly shown that he was a hero, if unexpected, and most importantly, that throughout his entire life and political career, he had served his time and a purpose. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yes, we do have one question. So this is one that came to my mind as well from Greg. Did the Trump impeachment work in the House follow the Rodino playbook? And also he says, was Jamie Raskin with Rodino then? I think maybe there's a different Raskin that was part of that. But anyway, if you want to tackle those two questions.
Okay, so well, the Jamie Raskin one's easy, so I'll do that one. That's the easier one, which is no, he wasn't there. I don't think even when they started the Trump impeachment, there were no members of the House Judiciary Committee under Rodino's chairmanship that were still members of Congress. As far as the Trump impeachment, I think that Rodino definitely would have felt that in both instances, they met the bar of high crimes and misdemeanors. I think what he would have preferred is, which, they did not have the luxury of time. And I think that he would certainly have preferred that the gathering of the evidence and the laying out of the evidence be done in a more of a deliberative process. But you don't always have the luxury to do that. And remember, when the Nixon impeachment started, Richard Nixon had just been reelected. So they did not face, in that sense, a time, clock running out. They knew that they had that time to take the time. When you're in the second term of somebody and the clock is running out, it makes it very difficult. And Rodino had faced this with Iran-Contra, which I didn't get into because we had a limited amount of time. Rodino was involved in that. And the whole Iran-Contra, in Rodino's mind, probably met the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors, but he felt that it was so late and the end of Ronald Reagan's second term that there's no way that they could have completed deliberation. So he didn't believe they should start the proceedings.
Okay, thanks. Actually, I guess I misread the second part of that. So, Greg, thanks for clarifying that. Greg is asking, did Raskin perform the Rodino role in the Trump impeachment?
Yes, I would say so. I think that he has the same sense of deliberation and thoroughness and research and understanding of the Constitution and preparation. So yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, here's a question from Joan. When did you decide to write the book? How long did it take? And I'll just add to that, if you could flesh out a little more your relationship with Peter over his career. I know you've mentioned a couple of times your role, but of course you were in other positions as well. So you want to kind of tackle that together.
Okay, so let me start and I'll be brief, but let me start at the beginning with my relation to Rodino, which will lend me to answer the other questions about the book. So I met Peter Rodino when I was in high school. I was the president of the Belleville High School Political Club, and the perk of that job was to meet any VIPs that came to the school. And he came to speak in October of 1968. I met him. I told him about the political club and how we all love politics. And being the smart politician that he was, 2 days later, I got a call from his office asking if I'd like to volunteer on his campaigns. And to paraphrase Casablanca, it was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. I worked on many of his campaigns. And then when I was a college professor, I spent the summers in his office, and eventually he hired me to be his press secretary. So it's a relationship that really began in 1968. As far as the book goes, to be totally honest with you, this is a book I hoped I didn't have to write, because I tried very hard in 1988, when Peter Rodino was retiring, to get him to write the autobiography he didn't write in 1974. And we had a book agent. He went up to New York. He met with some publishers. There was some interest. Obviously, they were, offering the same huge amount of money that they were in 1974, but there was some interest. And I really hoped that he would do this. He could not find a ghostwriter to help him that he was satisfied with. The project, never got off the ground. It's not something I could do. I needed to get a real full-time job. And about 10 years later, he sort of started again. He did some of these oral recordings, and it never happened. And so I always promised him, because of my background as a historian, that someday I would do this. He's the only major figure from the Watergate era without an autobiography or biography. So that was my promise to him. And so when I retired in 2017 from the government, after 30 years in the government, that was my job. So I literally spent close to 5 years writing the book, not only working at the Rodino archives, which are all at Seton Hall University in Newark. I helped collect them and box them and bring them there, never thinking I'd be the one to benefit. But I also researched at the Kennedy Library, the Johnson Library, a lot of congressional papers all over. And then because of COVID, thankfully, some wonderful archivists who helped me, and you can read in the introduction to the book, I acknowledge all of them because they deserve my thanks, through COVID, made all these documents available to me digitally or Xerox copies because the libraries were closed to visitors. That made it all possible.
Well, I think we owe you a debt of gratitude for taking on this project and documenting. I think it's a wonderful story. I enjoyed reading it. And I guess in terms of the archives, you couldn't criticize the person that put those together, right? That brought those organized.
Well, if I can just tell a quick anecdotal story about it, and not to get too much in the weeds on history and writing, but because I was trained as a historian and I was a college professor before I went to work for Rodino, when I went to work for him, and by the way, I got the job. I had spent the summers in his office working on legislation, but he had a bad experience with a press secretary, and so decided rather than hire somebody he didn't know who had experience, he would hire somebody he knew and trusted who had absolutely no experience, and that was me. And he would train me how to do the job, and he was true to his word. I still shudder when I think of some of my, my earlier writings of press releases and going into his office. And here he was, the hero of Watergate, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, sat there with me and went over line by line, teaching me how to be a press secretary. And I mean, he was true to his word. And of course, and then that's what I ended up doing for, the next 20 years. So he really opened up a whole really career for me. But in the office, because I was a historian, I was so conscious of everything. So when he told us, he called a couple of the senior people together and said, I'm going to retire, because we didn't know what he was, if he was going to run again or not. I started taking copious notes about every detail in a little separate notebook, thinking, okay, someday somebody's going to want to know this, like when, because nobody, we're having all these meetings. So I'd come back and I'd say, oh, this happened and we decided this. And then, put this in a file, and the file got in the boxes. So when I went up to start doing the research, there in a box that's marked Spinelli was this steno pad with all these absolute details, minute by minute, copious notes of every little nuance that went on leading up to Rodino's announcement of his retirement. I didn't need all those details, but they're there, and they're there for future historians as well.
Kind of like finding your own diary, I guess, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So David just says, just to say thanks for your engaging lecture, really well presented. You had a great seat to see some momentous history. And I know you just gave us an anecdote, but I mean, is there, what other kind of personal memory do you have that really stands out for you in terms of your, engagement with Peter, or some, historic event?
Well, I think that the thing that I most remember about Peter Rodino personally, besides for my time, working for him, and I mentioned, all that last 6 or 8 months of his career were just amazing because the accolades were unbelievable. And as I said, I got to go along. Oftentimes when camera crews came down from New York or national camera crews to do interviews, they always wanted him walking down the hall, somebody talking to him, which I got to do that. So my mother, living in New Jersey, got to see me on television, which was great. But the thing that I will remember the most, that is so vivid to me, is that primary campaign in 1972. Because the thing that I don't know that I even appreciated at the time, and I think people don't think about, when you get redistricted into a new district, your district takes a whole nother shape. You not only lose voters, but you lose your volunteers, you lose your campaign, chairman, you lose the people that, do fundraising for you, all of that. And he lost all of that. All of the towns where all those people lived were taken out of his district, including my town. So I wasn't even his constituent. So they were really in need of people. And so I was in college and I left early and I came down, and it literally was, I was driving a 10-year-old car that my Aunt Marie had given me. I would pick Rodino up at his house at 5:30 in the morning, just the two of us. We'd go to a factory gate. I'd hand out a brochure and say, "Would you like to meet the congressman?" And he would shake hands, and then we'd go on to the next event. It was just the two of us. I never forgot that. And really believing through that whole primary that we were probably going to lose. That was going to be the end of it. And then being at the Robert Treat Hotel that night, and then having the returns come in and finding out that we were not just winning, but winning in a way that was decisive, that his district would be safe. And the one thing I will say about Peter Rodino is, from that day forward, and if he was alive and here today, he would tell you this story. Anytime I was with him and we met somebody, he would tell people that story about how I left college early to help him. He never forgot it. He was grateful for that. And that's the kind of person he was. He really was a really good person who really cared about people, both in the large way as a progressive, but also on a one-on-one basis, and cared about the Constitution and lived it. Every speech I wrote for him, I had to figure out a way to bring in the preamble of the Constitution. And sometimes it was a little harder. He once was speaking at a Boy Scout troop, and I was a little stymied. And then I remembered, I was a Boy Scout. We have the Boy Scout oath. And I compared the Boy Scout oath to the preamble of the Constitution, which is the oath that we make as Americans to each other. But that he really did believe that, he lived that he brought that alive. And it was just a privilege, to work for him and to know him and to have him as a friend. And, it's maybe, it's a truism to say somebody changed your life, but he really did change my life. That day I met him in front of Belleville High School. But yet, having said that, as a historian, when I took on this project, I also wanted to write a book that was a fair, honest, objective biography of his life based on the scholarship and the material and what was there. And for those of you who have already read the book, you'll know there are times that I do that I push him and criticize him and question, why didn't he do this? Why didn't he do that? Because that's the biography he deserved. He deserved a fair, honest, accurate biography.
Yeah, thanks for that anecdote. I mean, it's very interesting to hear about how, as a speechwriter, you really had to channel the Peter Rodino, and in terms of what he would say and what he would focus on.
And can I just add one other thing, David, because this to me, I mean, this is just sort of the irony of life. I ended up working for, I think I am actually the only person who's worked for both the House Judiciary and the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I ended up also then working for Joe Biden, initially as the press secretary for the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then as his communications director. But the irony in the circle is, the only person that Peter Rodino ever endorsed as a presidential candidate before the Democratic convention The only one he ever did was Joe Biden in 1987. He had gotten to know Joe Biden because of the Judiciary Committees and their work on Iran-Contra. Biden came over and asked Rodino would he serve as co-chairman, national co-chairman of his presidential campaign, and he agreed to do that. So it just sort of was, again, this full circle that I ended up then working for a Biden after that. There's that very strong connection between the two.
Yeah, interesting. Excuse me. Greg asks, did his father, Peter's father, live long enough to see his success? Of course, you talked about his father coming over as an immigrant from Italy. So
Yes, he did. His father died. So again, I didn't get into this, but quickly, their names went through very many iterations. If you read the book, you'll see that. So he came to America as Pellegrino Rodino. Then at one point it was Pellegrino Rodini, and then eventually he became Rodino. And so it was a lot of work tracking all of this, but it went through all these iterations. And then as I mentioned, when Rodino got to grammar school, they anglicized all the Italian names. So he became Peter. He added Wallace as a middle name. I have no idea why. I can't ask him. He never told anybody why. And eventually then his father also changed his name to Peter Rodino. So he did live. Rodino was elected in 1948, and his father sadly died. He wasn't that old. He was in a bus accident, and the after effects of that, eventually he died in the 1950s. But he lived long enough to see him become a lawyer and, a decorated war hero, and to become a member of Congress.
Okay, great. So Katie, I guess, wants to put you on the spot here a little bit. Says, Mr. Spinelli, would you like to teach a class for Encore Learning? I mean, we have a lot of people that love politics as our members. You obviously have tremendous knowledge about the history of Congress and different historic events. So
David, it's probably a good idea to suggest she puts that into a suggestion in the survey at the end.
Okay, that's fine. But so you don't have to answer that, Larry. But
okay, thank you.
I wanted to pass that on. So,
that's very nice. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So Greg actually mentions Wallace was in honor of Henry Wallace, maybe.
Maybe. I don't know. And, it's one of the challenges. I didn't want to speculate because I asked everybody, including his wife, Joy. No one seems to know. There's no record of it anywhere. There's nothing that went on when he was in school, because he did this when he was in like junior high school. And there's nothing that went on in his life that would say, oh, it was that, or so I just don't know. So we'll just leave it as a mystery. But that's what it was. That he added that, and then it was there from that time forward.
Okay, I just have to add, Greg has seconded the suggestion from Katie. Yes, do the class. Just pass that on. Okay, so we actually don't have any questions, but one of the things that you do have a lot about in the book that I think could be interesting to our viewers here is, I think, well, you mentioned the Voting Rights Act, but there was a constant attempt, I guess, by mostly conservatives to water that down or not renew it. And Peter Rodino was, I think, at the head of the battle to keep that. And obviously, we're still fighting that battle today, and with the Supreme Court. I mean, this is my term, gutting it, right? But okay. So I don't know, whatever thoughts you have on the history of that would be, I think, interesting.
Well, yes. So, the major was, we all now know in hindsight, although many knew at the time, that as important as the 1964 Civil Rights Act was in terms of, outlawing segregation in public facilities, that really political power was the key. This was Dr. King had said this many times, that was the important step, and that was the Voting Rights Act. But to get it through, even then, it was supposed to be for 10 years. It was supposed to have a broader, more of a breadth to it. But I think they did the best they could. They accepted 7, and then every time the law came up to be renewed, to be reauthorized, it was always a struggle to extend it for more years and more years, and to add more things to it. And that was always the challenge. And so Rodino was always having to compromise. They never really, this is my opinion, I don't think they watered it down subsequently as much as they had to accept a smaller time horizon for it, and they couldn't add things that they wanted to add to it. The way that the law has ultimately been diluted has been through the courts, which is unfortunate, and I don't think that we understand the political realities today, that you're not going to pass legislation to be able to change any of that.
Right, but I think it's Peter that maybe use this term somewhere, that is thumb in the dike. Maybe there's something else, but holding back the attempts of.
Absolutely no, and there, in the House of Representatives particularly, he was able to bottle up so much legislation in the committee, because the Democrats lost the presidency and the Senate. So after 1980, Rodino was not only dealing with Ronald Reagan, but the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee was none other than Strom Thurmond. So on all of these issues, I don't think you could probably have found 2 members of Congress that were more ideologically different than Strom Thurmond and Peter Rodino. So what Rodino was able to do, because he controlled the committee, was to bottle things up. He'd send it to subcommittees. They'd have hearings after hearings after hearings, and they would delay it. And, you can get things out of committee through discharge petitions, but it's very, very difficult. You need a lot of members to sign on. So they were able to bottle up a lot. Where Rodino was not successful, and he was very disappointed in this, was on gun control. So in 1968, after the assassinations of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy in very quick succession after each other, we passed a gun control law that outlawed sending weapons, interstate sale of weapons. There were a variety of things the law did. And when and of course the NRA was not as powerful then, and was not as engaged in lobbying. But as conservative power grew, and once Reagan came in, this was something they wanted to change and transform. And Rodino tried to block that. There he had a harder time, because there were a number of Democrats who also wanted to see the law weaken. And so they were eventually able to shake the legislation out of the committee and weaken the law.
Okay, thank you for that perspective. And we certainly covered a lot of ground. I do want to ask you, I guess it was last month that you gave a talk to at the Carter Presidential Center. And I was just wondering, how did that come about? And did you, I guess you also have a relationship with the Carter family as well, right?
Well, it was a thrill to me. They invited me to come down to give a talk and then to do a book signing, which was really a thrill. But it particularly meant something. Well, 2 reasons. Number one, because that was one of the libraries where I couldn't go in person because of COVID, and they were very helpful to me. So I was very thrilled to be able to go back and show my appreciation and express my appreciation. But I was particularly thrilled to be back because Peter Rodino, in one of his oral histories, had lamented the fact that he was very disappointed that here his good friend Jimmy Carter, when Jimmy Carter wrote his autobiography, Keeping Faith, after he lost the 1980 election, that he never mentioned Peter Rodino's name in the book. And he was very disappointed in that. So I told the audience and the people at the library that I was so happy to come back here and to be able to give a talk for an hour about Peter Rodino to sort of make up for the fact that he was left out of the book. I think that this was, at least some fair compensation for that.
Okay, thank you for covering that. And we have no more questions in the Q&A. I think we have some reactions, some clapped hands and thumbs up. So I think there's a great appreciation for your talk. It's a great read, your book. I highly encourage people to read the book. And thank you for coming on to convey all your knowledge and to keep Peter Rodino's memory alive, and not just his role in Watergate, but all the other things that he accomplished in his life and the things he stood for. So I really appreciate you writing the book, spending the effort to do that, and coming on to talk with us today. And
well, thank you, David. And thank you all for helping me to do that. I really appreciate it. And thank everybody who was here today. I'm sorry I didn't get to see you in person, but thank you all for being here, and thank Encore Learning for inviting me. This was really great.
Okay, great. With that, thank you everyone for spending your time with us on this wonderful afternoon. And I just want to say the parting words, stay curious and open-minded. Above all, be kind to your fellow travelers. So, okay, take care. Thank you.